Okay, hello everyone and welcome to today's In Focus webinar, Practical Strategies to Support Children and Young People with Anxiety During COVID-19 Times. My name's Natasha and I'm a clinical consultant with BU. I'm a psychologist and I've completed a Masters of Educational and Developmental Psychology and a PhD, and I work with children and young people, their families and school communities. We're very fortunate today to be joined by two very eminent guest speakers as well, and whom I'll introduce in a minute. You can use the Q&A manager to submit a question to the panel. If you've already submitted a question with your registration form, there's no need to resubmit it here today. And we'll do our best to address as many questions as we possibly can in our Q&A later on and also in our post-webinar resource. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people as the traditional owners and custodians on the lands on which we're meeting. For me, I'm lucky enough to be sitting down in Lutruwita in Tasmania, and so I'd really like to pay my thanks and extend my respect and my gratitude to the Muanina people and to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd really like to thank them for their care of the land, the river and the sea, their connection with family and community, and their commitment to their rich culture and for sharing that with me. I'd also really like to extend my respect and thanks to the elders past, present, emerging on the lands on which you're all sitting today from around Australia and joining us here. Today is the first day that marks the beginning of National Reconciliation Week, and I'd also really like to encourage everyone to think about what action or actions you might be taking to mark this week of reconciliation. And if you're stuck for ideas, Reconciliation Australia have a number of fantastic resources and strategies and suggestions for you, and which take into consideration the restrictions that we have in terms of physical distancing at the moment. Today we'll be talking about anxiety, and it's worth recognising that we each bring to this conversation our experiences and our perspectives about mental health. Talking about mental health may bring up challenging thoughts, and I'd encourage everyone today to think about what sort of self-care strategies you might put into place if this is the case for you. It's really important that you prioritise your own well-being and take a break if you need to, and perhaps consider who you might reach out to and connect with after this webinar, or whether you might prefer to use one of the numbers or the websites that we've popped there on the screen available to you. There's no chat box in today's webinar. There's lots of people joining us, but definitely please use the Q&A manager if you'd like to post a general question through to the panel. So BU is the Australian National Mental Health Initiative that includes a framework, a professional learning development package, resources and secondary postvention support. All of this is complemented by an experienced and passionate workforce, and which includes educational and clinical consultants. It's led by Beyond Blue in collaboration with delivery partners Early Childhood Australia and Headspace. Our vision at BU is that every Australian early learning service and school is a positive, inclusive and resilient community where every child, young person, staff member and parent and carer can achieve their best possible mental health. Shortly, we'll hand over to our guests, Jenny and Sally, who will provide their wisdom and expertise around understanding and providing practical strategies and supports for children and young people experiencing anxiety related to COVID-19, as well as ways to embrace practices at school. Following this, we'll have a Q&A panel and we'll be responding to some of the questions that you've popped through to us before looking very briefly at the BU resources that might guide and support your support for children and young people. And so it really is my privilege, and I hope I don't fan out too much, to introduce our two guest and expert speakers here with you today. Jenny Hudson is a professor within the Department of Psychology and Director of the Centre for Emotional Health at Macquarie University. Jenny's research focuses on understanding the factors that contribute to children's emotional health and working to improve services available to children experiencing anxiety and other emotional disorders. Jenny's work at the Centre for Emotional Health impacts the lives of Australian families through the development of new ways for understanding and treating anxiety disorders. We're also very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Sally Fitzpatrick, who is a developmental and clinical psychologist, an honorary postdoctoral fellow at Macquarie University, and the acting program manager at Everymind. Sally's education and work history combine to highlight her commitment to advocating for the mental health and wellbeing of youth and their families through research and clinical practice. Sally is passionate about understanding the factors that contribute to mental health and wellbeing of all Australians and translating this knowledge into evidence-based programs that focus on children and families. Welcome to you both, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
It is a pleasure. Welcome to everybody. I'm presenting from the Eora Nation today, and I'm very excited to be here. Sal and I are very much looking forward to sharing information with you about how we can better support children and young people with anxiety during the COVID-19 pandemic. There's so many educators here from across Australia, and no doubt you're all experiencing kind of different pressures and issues. And I wish Sal and I really could be there in person in your staff rooms having a conversation over a cup of tea or a coffee. That's not possible today, but we are really grateful for BU for setting up this webinar and providing us with this opportunity to be able to kind of help provide better support for your students. So I wanted to just briefly touch on the importance of school staff and educators in ensuring children receive mental health support. Results from our National Mental Health Survey in Australia of children and young people, looking at those children who actually do experience a mental health problem, and over half of those Australian children reported receiving some sort of informal support from school staff, and this was primarily from their classroom teacher. So it's clear that schools and Australian teachers play a really important role in recognising and supporting children and young people with mental health problems, including anxiety. Sally and I recently did a study together on this topic and found that Australian educators actually agreed that dealing with anxiety was a shared responsibility, and schools are a really important part of sharing that responsibility. So Sal and I are really excited about trying to help fill that gap today by sharing our knowledge about how to best support our students with anxiety. So our objectives for today, let's see, there we go. We've got 5 of them. The first one is really to understand anxiety and what it is that we're talking about and why this situation at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic is causing so much anxiety for some students. We want to identify the key strategies for children and families struggling with anxiety at this time, and kind of strategies that are going to be relevant for you in school settings. Sal will also talk about knowing kind of when is the right time to suggest treatment, how to know when to suggest treatment and when you're kind of not dealing with it within the classroom setting or not dealing with it at a school level, where to go. And Sal's got some really important strategies about how you can embed new kind of practices within your school that might be a long-term strategy in supporting children or students with anxiety. So not just around kind of COVID-19, but kind of more broadly in the long term. All right, so a lot to achieve in a short space of time. Let's see how we go, and we'll hopefully have lots of question time at the end to kind of really drill down to some of the issues that we've talked about. All right, so what is anxiety? we're talking about anxiety disorders or problems with anxiety, but in actual fact, anxiety itself is a really normal emotion that we all experience. It's universal. We'll be talking today about how to help children and young people with high levels of anxiety, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it's kind of important really to understand what this concept of anxiety is, what it is that we're talking about, what it is that we're not talking about, because it is different from different emotional experiences that a person might experience, and we are focusing specifically on anxiety. All right, so it's a normal emotion. Let me skip to the next slide. As I mentioned, everybody does experience it. It's a basic emotion. And there are really 3 parts to this experience. So the first is kind of what happens in our body. And that's really the first thing that we might recognize when we experience anxiety. So we might feel, if you think about the most recent time, you might have felt nervous about something. You might get butterflies in your stomach. Your heart rate might can accelerate quite quickly. You might get sweaty palms. You might kind of all of a sudden feel tense. Lots of different things that happen in different people, but it is all a normal experience when our kind of bodies switch on. And so that kind of takes us to the next point around our thoughts, and that is a really critical component of anxiety, is what we're thinking. So we only ever feel anxious when we think something bad is going to happen. So when we've detected threat in our environment, or by that I mean kind of thinking that something bad is going to happen or perhaps might have happened in the past. So that this kind of anxiety response only switches on when that has been detected. And it may be real or it might be imagined, it might be exaggerated, but it doesn't matter, it switches on. The system works just the same whether it's real or imagined, and this becomes our experience of anxiety. Now, the third really important component is our actions, or what we do. And it is a kind of a normal response to have a range of different responses to anxiety. It could be to run away from the situation, which is really common, or try and stay away from it as much as possible. And it could be to stay and fight the situation. So there's a few other different responses that we have as well, but the primary one that often happens is this avoidance and staying away from situations that scare us. It's pretty functional, because if you've got something terrifying coming towards you, it's important to be able to have the energy to be able to run away from it. And so it's kind of our bodies equipping us to be able to respond to threat. But it does switch on sometimes when it doesn't need to, when it's more an imagined threat or not as real as what it may be. All right, so that gets us to the next point, in that really anxiety sits on a continuum. We've got this kind of optimal range in the middle, and most of us sit here in this kind of optimal space. If you're a psychopath, you might sit down this kind of low end, but hopefully that's none of us here, I'm sure not. But most of us will sit in this kind of optimal range in the middle. But for some people, they experience this high level of anxiety. It's not different from the anxiety that's in this optimal range. It just happens more often and more intensely. So they might experience these bodily symptoms of anxiety, that kind of stomach, the butterflies in your stomach, or heart racing, sweaty palms, all of those symptoms on a more daily basis. And so kids might talk about having tummy aches or not feeling well. They might talk about having headaches, not being able to sleep, lots of different symptoms that go along with that. We also know that children with anxiety focus on threat a lot. They're more likely to focus on something bad happening in a situation. So if they walk into a playground full of kids, they're more likely to, other children might be focused on kind of what they're playing, or what other things are going on. But a child who has anxiety might go into that situation going, oh my goodness, look at all these people close together, I'm going to catch COVID-19, that's for sure, I'm going to die. And they're going to be more likely to think something bad is going to happen walking into that situation that's not necessarily threatening. We also know that children with anxiety are more likely to stay away from situations that are scary. And that's a really key component of anxiety, which I'll talk a lot more about today. But the strategies that we are focusing on are really for those children and young people at this high end of the continuum. So, and when we talk about anxiety problems or an anxiety disorder, it's at this high end. It's that the anxiety happens more frequently. It happens more days than not, or on a daily basis, and it interferes with their life and stops them from being able to go to school. All right, and we know that anxiety is a common mental health problem. It does place a child at risk for problems later on in their life as well. They're more likely to be anxious later in life, more likely to have depression and other mental health problems as well. So it is an important problem that we need to pay attention to. All right, so why is COVID-19 causing so much anxiety? We know that we feel anxious when we perceive threat in some way. And so the whole pandemic has meant that our health is more at risk. So more than it would be on a usual basis. And there's more uncertainty as well. Family jobs might have been affected. Family finances might have been more at risk as well. So there's more threat. There's something, compared to usual, something bad is more likely to happen. So it's understandable that some people might be experiencing more anxiety than usual. And also this uncertainty about whether or not something bad may happen also adds to that as well. All right. But there's a lot of different factors that might impact on how a child might respond to the current pandemic as well. So lots of different child factors. So the child's temperament, the way they tend to think, so that their thinking styles, like I talked about before, and a range of different factors like their regulation of emotions, but also a lot of family factors as well might impact, and a lot of environmental factors. How much exposure the child's had to trauma in the past, how much exposure they've had to the virus, the family situation. So lots of different things that might impact on an individual child's response. And the students that you are coming across will have come from very different backgrounds and have different exposure to these different factors as well. All right, we're seeing a range of different types of anxiety at the moment. For some kids who are not having to go to school and not having to face the usual things that worry them. They're actually not anxious at the moment, and that their anxiety might come down, but we are seeing lots of different types of anxiety emerge at the moment. So maybe these are children that have had anxiety in the past, or maybe they've been at risk, or perhaps not anxious in the past as well, and it's starting to kind of crop up, and this situation has created more anxiety. So there are lots of different types of anxiety that a child might experience. So there's this kind of general worries, so worries about getting sick, that their worry might be focused on that. Am I going to get the virus? Is someone in my family going to get the virus? Is someone going to die? Will they be behind in their schoolwork? So they might have kind of schoolwork or performance-related worries. We kind of stick this all together in kind of general worries. And often children with general worries there might be something going on for them now, but they'll predict into the future. So if they're worried about not catching up on schoolwork now, they might be worried, okay, that's it. I'm not going to graduate from high school. I'm not going to be able to get a job. I'm not going to be able to go to university. So the situation now might kind of have these flow-on effects in terms of what they're worried about. So we're seeing lots of children actually who have these general worries searching for a lot of information. They're worried about, they have these health worries, trying to search for lots of information online about the virus and kind of getting stuck in this repetitive cycle, asking lots of questions, talking about a lot of stomach aches as well. So children with social worries, so these might be not related to COVID-19 at all, but might be as a result of what's happening. So because they're in new learning environments, perhaps in an online learning environment, they've got to worry about their online image and whether other students are talking about them while they're on online learning, or maybe they're coming back to school for the first time and they haven't seen their friends and they're worried about they haven't had their hair done, or whatever worry it might be that they're experiencing. So worrying about what other people think of them is a core part of that social worry. Some other children might be worried about separating from their parents, so that might be a general concern for them, but perhaps that's exaggerated at the moment because of COVID-19. And there might be a lot of children also who have germ-related obsessions and thoughts already, so what we would kind of refer to as obsessive-compulsive thoughts and behaviours, so where they're worried about getting sick and so having to wash their hands a lot more. So what we're seeing is that some children with this obsessive compulsive worries are actually feeling like they need to wash and kind of be more prepared even more than usual. So there's lots of different things that might be impacting children and young people with anxiety at the moment. All right, so I want to talk about some general principles first before I focus on specific strategies for anxiety. So these are relevant for general mental health, not just for anxiety, but I think they're important. I can't launch in talking about strategies for anxiety without having mentioned these. So I'm going to just talk about these first two strategies to start with, and then I'll talk more about the six key, what we see as really critical in terms of helping support children and young people at the moment. So let me just take some water because all right, so these first strategies are, the first one is around providing a safe and secure environment. So a child's mental health is really impacted by whether or not they feel safe and secure. So if a child is coming to school or coming from an environment where they are not safe and when they're experiencing violence, we know that that is going to have an impact on their general mental health. If they're coming to school and they are being bullied, we know that that's going to have an impact on their mental health. So it's important for good general mental health is for young people to be able to have a safe and secure environment in which they can learn, and kind of critical to being able to be at their best mental health. Now, the second one is a healthy lifestyle, and these are things that we all know we should do and that young people should do, and to some extent for teachers this is out of your control, but important to mention that we know that particularly for teenagers, if their sleep is out of whack, if they're not eating well, if they're not exercising, then all of these things will impact on their ability to regulate emotions and their ability to regulate anxiety and fear. So if they haven't got those strategies in place, then that is going to put them kind of on the back foot in terms of being able to regulate stress or regulate their stress and their fear when they're faced with challenging situations. So important that those things are kept in mind. And also because kids have been away from perhaps their usual activities as well, that perhaps they're less able to, perhaps their sleep routines have been out of whack because they've been sleeping in, or that they're not sticking to the routines at home. So these are important things to remember, even though you don't, as a school, necessarily have control over those, but think of the things that might be impacting on the young person's ability to regulate their emotions. All right, so now let me get to these specific 6 guiding principles, or 6 specific strategies. Now, we've just launched this website at Macquarie that Sal and I worked on together, along with a number of other people at Macquarie, where we've set up this website for teachers, and we've also got information there for parents, and we're working towards developing materials for students as well. And so we'll give you that link if you wanted to have a look at that. And a lot of the content that we're covering today will also be in that website, with kind of tip sheets and videos from different people covering these strategies. So hopefully you will find that useful. We really developed that based on what teachers were wanting and what they needed. So hopefully it will hit the mark for you. All right, so the first strategy is to really provide a safe and supportive space for young people. So this means listening to them and providing opportunity for them to come and talk to you about things that they might be worried about. And if they are coming to you talking about their worries or letting you know about them, then really important to reflectively listen to them. So you might want to kind of make a comment back to them if they're telling you about their worries, or if you notice that they're worried in the class. So saying something like, I see you're really worried about being at school today, or I can see you're worried about whether or not the other kids are following the rules about washing their hands, or whatever it is that they might be worried about that you've picked up on. If they've talked to you about their worry, maybe using their words if possible. And because some kids don't like using the word scared, they might say they're stressed about something, but they're definitely not scared about it. So trying to use the words that they've come up with is really helpful. But if they're not using any words, it may just be that you reflect on what it is that you've noticed, and providing that kind of safe space for them to come to you to talk about it. But you may notice that the child's struggling, so you may want to reach out to them and talk to them, or to their parents, and acknowledge that they're worried or stressed about something. Sometimes this may be all that they need, is for you to just connect with them and to have another adult or somebody in their life just listen to their worries. That may be all that they need. But then if that's not all they need, there may be some other strategies you might want to put in place that we'll talk about. But one important thing to remember, I think, that is easy to forget, particularly if you see yourself as a very supportive teacher, and if you're here on this webinar today, I'm guessing that you prioritise mental health and think that it's important. And so you might see yourself as a supportive, empathic educator, but it's easy to forget that for some children, particularly those with kind of generalised worries or concerns, that they might see you as a major threat. They might worry about getting into trouble, even though that you've never raised your voice in your classroom before, if they've never got in trouble or done anything wrong, they may still be terrified that they're in trouble in some way. So just remembering that in your interactions with them, and wanting to support them and let them know that you're there to help them, but just keeping that in mind. And especially if you're calling them up, or pulling them out of class in some way to talk to them, the first thing that a child with anxiety is likely to think is, oh goodness, I'm in trouble, so I've done something wrong, even though they may have never done anything wrong before. So just keeping that in mind when you are providing a safe and supportive space for young people. All right, so the second strategy is probably, if you only take away one point from today, I want you to remember this one, that avoiding situations makes a student feel safer in the short term, but actually in the long term, it makes anxiety worse. It prevents a child from learning accurate information about the situation and accurate information about their ability to cope. If we remember that kids with anxiety focus on the negative, they focus on all the bad things that might happen. So we want to actually help correct that information. We need to encourage them to approach difficult situations rather than staying away from them or avoiding them. So as much as possible, we want to encourage children to approach difficult situations. It's a really normal response for students to want to stay away from scary situations, but it does, in the long run, make it much worse. And it's also really natural for parents or for teachers as well to actually want to protect the child and to kind of take them away from scary situations. So if they don't want to come to school or if they don't want to do a presentation in class, it's easy for educators to say, okay, well, don't worry about it, let's do it next time, or kind of not support them towards actually approaching the situation. But we strongly encourage school staff to encourage children to gradually approach situations that they're scared of. So if a child's worried or nervous about something, we would actually step up to organise that kind of gradual step ladder for them to face the situation. So I'll show you what we would use in a treatment setting, and I've made this one relevant for the learning environment, so you could use it in a school setting as well. But you can see this worksheet, and I will provide you these resources at the end of the webinar so you can have access to these worksheets. You may want to work collaboratively with your students to develop this, or you may just want to have it in the back of your mind. This is what you're working towards in getting the student to gradually approach situations that they find difficult. So here we've got the situation, the goal that the student wants to work towards is in the learning environment, being able to face that kind of online learning environment. And here's what their worried thought and what they're worried about is going to happen in the situation. So we're wanting to set up steps that will help challenge this thought and help them develop new, more accurate information about, this is what they think in the situation, but we want to help teach them that actually that's not accurate. So we break it up into low, medium and high steps, and you can see these numbers beside them as we use a worry rating scale of 0 to 10. And so 10 is the really high anxiety provoking situations, and these ones here are kind of the lower, that a little bit stressful but not too much. So we'd start with these low steps and gradually work through them. We set up a reward system as well that you could set up in the classroom, or you could work that out with the parents as well, and getting the child to gradually work up to these challenging situations. So rather than kind of saying, okay, don't worry about participating in online learning, I'll give you something else to do, but you don't have to participate in online learning, here is a step ladder that you can work towards that instead. Okay, all right. So the strategy is getting them to gradually approach situations that they find challenging. All right, so the next tip is around encouraging realistic thinking. We've talked a lot about kind of thoughts, and we know that children with anxiety, or students with anxiety, will think the worst in a situation. So to help them think more realistically and more rationally, we encourage them to be more like detectives with their thoughts. So it's not about telling them what they should think and that nothing bad's going to happen, but it's about encouraging them to kind of take a different approach with their thoughts. So one way to do this is for teachers to be curious about the students' worries, help them to be, for the student to be more curious about their worries too. So working out what their worried thought is, what do they think is going to happen in the situation, and then asking them questions like, what are the facts, or what happened last time, what's most likely to happen, will you be able to cope? So those kind of questions really help a child to try and be more realistic about the situation and develop more rational or more realistic thoughts. It takes practice, but it's something that we find really works. The most effective way is actually facing the situation, but these are good coping strategies that can help. All right, so here's an example of another worksheet that we would use in treatment, but you can think about this as a structure for helping a child be more like a detective with their thoughts. You can see here's the worried thought at the top, and then if you go down to kind of this bigger box, you can see a whole lot of different thoughts or different evidence collecting. So in terms of collecting evidence like a detective, you might ask questions like, what are the facts, what's happened last time? And here's an example of kind of all the different evidence that a child might come up with. And then they come back up to this more realistic thought. So once they've collected all the evidence, what do they think is most likely? What's a more realistic thought they can have? And with the idea that will hopefully bring their worry rating down. So this is a strategy that works well in conjunction with getting them to gradually face the situations. You don't have to use this worksheet, but it's just there as a structure to think about how you might want to challenge or how to respond to their anxious thoughts. All right, the next tip is around encouraging independence and avoiding reassuring the child too much. So we want to encourage children to face difficult situations, and part of this is encouraging them to be more independent. And with anxiety, we know often tend to elicit more help from those around them. So it might be a natural response for you to want to provide more help or answer a lot of their questions. But we actually find that providing lots of reassurance makes the anxiety worse. So what we want to do instead is trying to push it back to the child to solve the situation on their own and can think up the solution for themselves. So what do you think might happen here? What do you think might be a good strategy? Or how do you think you can help yourself feel better right now? What are some strategies that you think you could put in place? So those kind of questions, they don't solve the situation for the student. They put it back to them to actually, you're there supporting them, but doing it in a way that's encouraging their independence and not providing too much reassurance. All right. So step 5 is around kind of similar to that, but paying attention to courageous behaviour. We know that the more attention you pay to something, the more likely that behaviour is to increase. So in a sensitive way, try and encourage or focus on the times when the child does push themselves out of their comfort zone. Maybe it's that they don't usually answer a question in class and you've noticed that they've done that, or that they're not usually at school and you've noticed that they've actually attended. So focus on that, not in front of other students and calling them out and embarrassing them, perhaps in front of their peers, remembering that you as a teacher may be perceived as a threat, but just noticing that when they are actually being courageous and pushing themselves out of their comfort zone. All right. So finally, this is a really important one, and it's about being a kind of calm and coping role model. We know that children learn how to react by watching how the adults in their life deal with stress. So this is really hard for school staff and educators at the moment, because you're under enormous pressure to be able to be flexible with all of the changing rules and the ways that you've kind of needed to get online, and then back into the classrooms as well for different states. But think about the messages that you're communicating in the way that you handle your stress. So when you turn up to a classroom session, whether that be face-to-face or online, think about what you're bringing to that classroom in terms of the way that you're managing stress. So trying to be a calm, coping role model. Now, I've said coping, not a mastery model. It's not that you've got to have it all together and have all the strategies, but responding in a way that it's teaching children how to manage stress. So it may be that you need to put some strategies into place to better support your own mental health. And we've got on our website, I've got some tips around that, or things that you can do in being able to support your own mental health as well. All right, so we've talked about these 6 strategies that you can put in place in the classrooms, but also that may not be enough. So it may be that you've noticed that the child's really struggling, they're skipping a lot of school. When should you suggest referrals? And Sal's going to talk a lot more about this and how best to manage this in a classroom in a school setting. But we think that intervening earlier is easier. We know that a child who is anxious is more likely to be an anxious teenager and also more likely to be an anxious adult. So getting help earlier is better. And if the anxiety is impacting on their life in any way, if they're not able to come to school, if they're skipping, missing a lot of classes, not able to attend, then I think it is important to seek help. Or if the parent's distressed about it or the students are showing signs of distress. I think that is really important. And I'm going to hand over to Sal now to talk more about how to embed practices and how to kind of take these strategies and take it to the next level that's going to work for your school setting. Thanks, Sal.
Thanks, Jen. And hi, everyone. Welcome from the Indigenous land of the Awabakal people here in Newcastle, where I am at the moment. Unfortunately, due to tech difficulties, I can't see the slides on the screen, so Jen's going to do that for me and I'm going to talk to them. We know from our research that a lot of teachers haven't had specific training about how to respond to a child who's anxious. But most teachers tell us that they still have seen children with elevated anxiety in their classroom at school. And they've also told us that they're really unsure where to go to get helpful information about how to respond to children with anxiety. The knowledge and skills that you've heard Jen just go through, those 6 principles, are going to help with some of this. And what you've really heard is some of the best practices you can use to directly help the children in your classroom. But research also tells us that attending training like this webinar probably isn't enough to really result in change for teachers or for students. That's because implementing anything new takes planning and practice. And I'm talking to the converter when I tell teachers this. You guys know more than most that practice and planning is really important. You don't teach your students something new and expect that they will automatically learn that information or be able to apply it. You set up lesson plans that reinforce the content and you go through that with your students. And that's what needs to also happen with learning to support children with anxiety. Taking this information today is the first step, but I'm going to encourage you to try and embed it in your school environment. In essence, training really is only one part of successfully implementing anxiety management for children. But there are some key things that you can do to ensure that you're best placed to help children. Thanks, Jen. The first thing to understand is the extent to which children are actually showing heightened and unhelpful levels of anxiety at your school, particularly in response to COVID-19. And the best and quickest way of doing that is in a staff meeting, going around and talking generally about what is the response that you are seeing from your students. But this is also really important to do outside of COVID. It can be really helpful to not only know the extent to which children are experiencing anxiety, but also the extent to which teachers in your school feel like they're also struggling to respond to the issue. So being able to highlight the needs of children is important, but also being able to recognise the support teachers need is equally important. And doing a survey at school can tell you whether staff feel that they've got the required skills and knowledge to respond to children and the skills they want to develop, and then you can plan the type of training that meets those needs. So a simple scanning exercise as this is not only going to help teachers, but it's also going to help your school executive understand the needs of students in your school and for yourselves and plan how to respond. Thanks, Jen. In terms of what to do if you're concerned, sometimes it's not enough to have new knowledge and skills. Sometimes, as Jen said, you are going to need more support or guidance from either your school counsellor, school psychologist, welfare staff, depending on the system that you're in. But it can be really hard to know when you need to contact these people, who they are, when they work, or even what they can offer you. So it can be really helpful for all of this information to be kept in a central place in a school. It's up to date and easily accessible by all staff. It can be equally important to have a list of external referrals. It may sound simple, but having the contact details of local child and family psychologists or even online programs such as those offered by the Centre for Emotional Health can be really helpful when you're talking to parents. Thanks, Jen. But we know these processes don't happen by themselves. So developing those internal processes at school, creating and maintaining external referrals and evaluating whether these supports are even working needs to be undertaken by someone. And we all know that these sorts of initiatives are most successful when they're the responsibility of an identified person or people. Now, that could be your school executive, it could be your welfare team, it could be a member of staff who's really interested in anxiety. But this is really important to have someone who's willing to take this on. Otherwise, everyone is really unsure about where they go, why they go there, or how they do it. So once this person or people have been identified, then what they can do is go back to the staff with a proposal about the extent to which anxiety is causing concern based on the survey that you've done and how teachers in the school can respond to anxiety within that environment. All the research about implementing any new knowledge and skills tells us that engaging staff from the beginning in this process is really critical if we want teachers to effectively respond to children with anxiety. So everyone on the webinar today is taking that first step in starting to learn those processes. I really encourage you to go back to your schools and talk about how you can embed them and how you can embed these processes widely across the school so that you are also supported to be able to support children. Thanks, Jen. The Centre for Emotional Health at Macquarie has a range of online and in-person resources that you can access, and this includes a range of programs for children from preschool all the way through to late adolescence. Our Cool Kids suite of programs, which are our most well-known programs, have been in existence for more than 20 years. They're evidence-based programs that can be used to target specific types of anxiety, such as social anxiety or maybe anxiety for students during the HSC, or they can be used much more broadly to look at anxiety and depression. The other thing the centre does is to try on new programs to ensure that what we offer is based in evidence and is effective. And sometimes this can give families a chance to receive high-quality programs at a much lower cost. So, for example, we're currently running a trial of a new online program for primary school-aged children who are both anxious and victimised by their peers. So if you're interested in this sort of program, don't hesitate to email me. My details are at the end of this webinar, and I can give you more information about that program. But I've also listed on this slide a range of other wonderful resources, including resources at BU that provide great information for teachers, for students and families. And this information really does range for primary school children and putting it in a language that's important for them, but also the same skills and knowledge for adolescents, just contextualised to their age. Thanks, Jen. So we've given you a lot of information today in a relatively short period of time, and I suppose for us the take-home messages that we really want you to be focused on are really those 6 guiding principles that Jen spoke about before. It's important to be able to provide a safe and supportive space. Most importantly, and this is the take-home message of all of them, this is the one that's most key, is encourage approach, not avoidance, because avoidance maintains anxiety. We want to encourage realistic thinking. We want to encourage independence and avoid reassuring too much, which is a really hard thing to do as either a parent or a teacher, but it's really important in not maintaining anxiety. We want to pay attention to courageous behaviour, and we want to be calm and coping role models, which means we also need to be conscious of our own anxiety and our own mental health. And finally, we really encourage you to think about how you can embed these new practices into your school. Thanks, Jen. We've provided you with our contact details, so please don't hesitate to contact Jen or myself about today's webinar, about other ways that we might be able to support you with students at your school, or even about the trials we're running where your families might be interested in engaging with new programs.
Thank you so much, Jenny and Sally, for providing us with all your wisdom and your information and with such relevant and transferable and practical strategies. And I feel like all that you've spoken about is going to really support our teachers and our school communities, not only in this time, but in times long after COVID-19 has been and passed. We'd like to take this moment now to pose some of the questions, and I can see from the question and answer manager that there have been a number of really interesting and fascinating questions put to the panel by the audience. So we might kick off, if it's okay, perhaps Sally, with you. I've got a question here from a participant who asks, what can we best do to support students, particularly anxious students, as they return to face-to-face learning? And what do staff need to do to create a positive mindset around school being a safe place?
Thanks, Natasha. I think that's a great question. I think it's important to recognise that children around Australia are at different points of returning to school. So some are not back yet, some are coming back in a staggered fashion, and some are back full-time. But ultimately, the strategies that Jen spoke about can be used at all of these points. I think the very first thing to remember is that returning to school can be a little anxiety-provoking for children and teachers alike, regardless of whether anxiety is an ongoing issue for you. This is really normal and to be expected. Anxiety shown by children at this time doesn't necessarily mean they have an anxiety disorder. So normalising these feelings and acknowledging that things really are a little different can be really helpful to children. But focusing on how children can cope and modelling coping with them will help them settle, and it will also help staff settle. So it's really important to be able to focus on the measures, the positive measures that your school has in place to be able to support children and staff. But for children who are typically anxious or find transition difficult, they're probably the children that are going to be most likely affected. So going back to the 2 main strategies that Jen talked about are really what we want to be able to do and focus on for those children. So the first was around recognising and changing unhelpful thinking. which is mainly catastrophic. So when you hear children predict that the worst thing that's going to happen, that's usually an indicator for you that their worry is really high. So you can use the detective thinking skills that Jen talked about to help children. But the trick is to ask the question and let the child answer. As adults, what we often do is we ask the question, and then if the child doesn't come up with an answer straight away, we try to reassure them by providing the answer. So the sorts of best questions that you could use would be things like, what are the facts? How likely is this feared event that you're worried about going to happen? And how are you going to be able to cope? So, for example, if you have a child who's really fearful about going back to school because they're thinking they might get COVID-19, what you might be able to do is talk to a parent or talk through the child and ask things like, well, what are the facts? And the child might say, most people don't have it, most people get better. In terms of what's likely to happen, well, I probably won't get it. Only a very small number of people in all of Australia have got it. And what about coping? How would you cope? And that's when you get to focus on the things that work in your school. Washing hands, social distance. I've been sick before, I've had the flu before, but I've got better. And these questions work for almost any anxiety children are going to raise during this time. But it's worth practicing with a colleague. It's not always easy to remember them, so the more you can practice them, the better it's going to be. And I think the second strategy that Jen talked about is the main one. It's about reducing avoiding situations. That's because avoidance maintains anxiety. We want children to face the thing they're scared of, but to do it in a gradual and stepped way. So for children who are back at school and they're scared of going out into the playground with their peers, you might be able to set up a gradual approach to being able to achieve that. They might initially start talking to a friend. They might spend part of recess or lunch in the playground and part in the library. They might play with one friend and then gradually play with more friends for longer periods of time. So that step-ladder approach or step-by-step approach really does work the best.
Thank you so much, Sally. I really appreciate the way it's broken down into those sort of, those simple steps and strategies, but also so many opportunities perhaps to support young people to do exactly what you've both talked to around practicing new skills and developing those new skills and over time. I've got another question now, and I might pose this to you, Jen, if that's okay. A participant member has asked, how can we assist parents in understanding how their anxiety is impacting the successful return of their children to school? How can we do this compassionately, not disregarding their concerns, but trying to limit the fear that it is creating with their child?
It's a really good question, because we know that if a child is experiencing high anxiety, that it's also likely that the parents are experiencing anxiety. So that when we talked about that continuum, when you're at that high end of the continuum, there tends to be a bit of genetic, some heritability there. So we know that anxiety does run in families, both through genetics and also through the environment. So it is likely for child's anxious that the parents also anxious, and that can be really challenging for teachers to be able to best manage. It can be quite frustrating or overwhelming if the parent's calling up a lot and worrying a lot. But yeah, as that question kind of was suggesting, that it does really have an impact on the child's stress and anxiety as well. If the parent's communicating these negative messages, then it's going to impact on how scared the child is about coming back to school. And that can be really difficult because your responsibility is for the child, and it's not necessarily providing mental health support for parents. So, but doing that in a way, and perhaps it's suggesting it kind of in the same way that we talked about with supporting young people with anxiety, we can use those same strategies of providing a safe and supportive space for parents to be able to listen to their concerns and their worries, and using those same reflective listening techniques I talked about. So, I hear you're really worried about what's happening for your child at school, or I hear you're really concerned about his return to school and whether or not it's safe. So just reflecting back their anxiety or their worry. And that may be, again, all that they need, and that just, okay, somebody understands that I'm worried about this, and that may be all that is needed from the teacher. But it may not be enough, again, and so kind of thinking about how we can support the parents to better support their child. And so what we want to do is get the child back to school, or we want to get the child to be actually facing those challenging situations rather than letting the parent kind of protect the child or not allow them to push themselves in challenging situations. So it's how that you can work together with the parent to get that gradual step-by-step approach for them to returning to school or whatever it is that the parent's worried about. So it's doing that in a gradual way with the parents. Maybe it's working with them on a step ladder of how they can get the child back to school and putting in some reward systems in place perhaps, and working together with them, because if a parent's anxious and they're worried about their child, that they want the best for their child, they're worried about them, they want to provide the best, have the best outcomes for them. And so it's using that motivation and that support to actually get the right outcomes and helping support them. Maybe also teachers might need to school principals giving parents their rationale for why you're doing this. So it's really important that we get your child back to school. And the reason this is important is because we know that by staying away, it makes anxiety worse. We help your child's anxiety come down. And based on the evidence, this is what we know works best. So then giving some kind of rationale or thinking behind why you're putting these strategies in place or these suggestions in place might be really helpful just to calm the parent's anxiety.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And I really liked how you frame that. So really the child is at the centre of the discussions there. So there's an acknowledgement and validation to parents, but that the child's best interests are acknowledged as being in the forefront of everyone's minds and are at the centre of the conversation. And it reminds me, we have a whole sort of module within BU about family partnerships that people might like to look to and that can support people in having those sorts of challenging or potentially challenging conversations. I'm just looking at the time and I can see we've got perhaps time for one more or maybe even two more if we're very cheeky questions. So I might throw to you, Sally, with the next one. Sally, I've got a question here that says, we have students with ASD who are returning back to school after a break away from routine. Can you suggest any strategies on how to help them handle the anxiety as they return?
Yeah, that's a great question. We know that children with more specific needs can be experiencing higher levels of anxiety at this time. And we know from the research that autism and anxiety are really closely linked. There are some underlying neurological reasons for that. We can't change these and there's not time to go into them. But there are also some social reasons which help maintain anxiety for children with autism. And the first one is that children with autism like routine. And so they're less keen on trying new things. So avoidance can be really helpful for them in keeping their anxiety going and maintaining that anxiety, but not ever really dealing with it. And I also think that adults supporting children with autism, whether that's parents or teachers, also try to maintain the status quo, because that means is that it causes less distress for the child. Now, the severity of autism is going to impact on the extent to which both of these things occur. So being aware of the level of the child's functioning is going to be really helpful in planning the way that you respond. But basically, what we want you to do is use the same strategies that we've already discussed earlier, in which Jen talked about. At the Centre for Emotional Health, we use detective thinking, we use facing fears to help children with autism, and we do it really successfully. But there's a couple of points to remember. Some children on the spectrum will engage in detective thinking more easily than others. Now, we want to try and encourage children to think differently, to focus on the probability of the feared event. But sometimes these children can be really concrete in their thinking and determined to provide evidence for the unhelpful thought. At those times, we don't want to end up with an argument with the child. And if you're finding yourself in an argument about trying to change thinking, don't go there. What can be more helpful is to focus on the behavioural strategies around reducing avoidance. So trying to start with those easier steps and working your way up to the harder ones, encouraging the child to identify these steps and rewarding them for that can be really helpful. If the child won't engage in the process, to take the pressure off and ask them to do one thing at a time with a reward. You can, in your own mind, gradually increase the level of those steps for the children. And I would use the sorts of strategies that you use in teaching children with autism. What are the things that are most useful for your kids? Are they reward motivated? Do they want to please? Can they be easily encouraged? Use those sorts of strategies to engage them with the facing fear type of approach.
Thank you so much for that, Sally. That was fantastic and really helped to bring to life again the strategies that you've each spoken to. I think, unfortunately, we've run out of time for any further questions today. But thank you, Jenny and Sally, so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us. We are really appreciative.
Pleasure.
I just wanted to quickly finish to let everyone know that there are also BU resources that might be able to further support the sorts of supports and actions that you might take away from today and to try out and to enact in your classrooms and across your schools and with your staff as well. I think probably one of the takeaway points to make is that with BU, there is a consultant allocated to every school across Australia. So certainly if there's been anything that's been particularly interesting or you would like to have further conversations about how this might look in your school, please do reach out to your consultants because they are available to have those conversations with you. Very quickly, we have a range of fact sheets and other professional learning resources and equipment that's going to support you to be that calm, coping role model and to help your confidence to feel as though you're going to be able to manage the conversations that you are having. We have another resource that I'd really encourage you to have a look at, which is the Mental Health Continuum. I won't have time to go into it today, unfortunately, but definitely check it out on the website and it can really guide your understanding, noticing and supporting students with mental health concerns more generally. Thank you all so much for coming along to today's webinar. To let you know, the webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the BU website. We'll be sending out your certificates of participation and we'd really appreciate you to complete a post-webinar feedback that you'll be redirected to in just a moment so that we can capture your feedback and make sure we continue to provide you with meaningful and relevant events. Lastly, though, we just wanted to leave you with this final message, I can click my slide, that we cannot have the same expectations of ourselves and others as we would in normal weeks. These are not normal weeks. So please be patient and kind with others and yourselves. And thank you so much for joining us here today.